The night air over Flaxford had the damp, ironed smell of hymn books, kept too long in a cupboard. From the churchyard of St. Jude's, one could hear a thread of music winding out between the grey stones, a woman's voice, pure but a little tired, running through a Latin hymn that had not been fashionable since Pope Pius VI. The clock on the town hall had just struck midnight. Only the milk lorry on Market Hill bore witness, its driver pausing to stretch his back and frown at the echo. In Flaxford, music after 11 was considered either culture or nuisance depending on who produced it. Tonight it came from the convent chapel, which lent the sound a certain immunity. Still, the driver made a mental note to mention it to his sister, who worked at the post office. Inside the dark nave, candles burned low in brass holders, throwing long tilting shadows across carved saints. Sister Magdalene knelt in the front pew, eyes closed, hands folded. She was not the singer. The voice came from the choir stalls behind the organ screen, out of sight. And, as it turned out of permission, the organist, Mr. Aubrey Frimble, a man whose moustache suggested authority over both pedals and people, had gone home at 9:30. The key to the loft was in his waistcoat pocket. Yet someone had reached the choir stalls, drawn out the portable harmonium, and begun this curious midnight recital. In the vestry, the vicar, the Reverend Pennington, dozed in an armchair intended for visiting bishops. He had been reading the proofs of the parish newsletter and was startled awake by the final, sustained note of the hymn, high, tremulous, and not at all reverent in its effect. He hurried into the nave, his clerical shoes squeaking. "Who's there?" His voice, though meant to sound firm, trembled as much as the candles. The singing stopped. A faint rustle as of robes brushed against oak answered him, then silence. Reverend Pennington reached the choir screen and peered through the fretwork. A shadow moved, tall, veiled, unmistakably a nun's outline. For an instant he thought of Sister Agnes from the old teaching order, long gone to a hospice. But that was absurd. "Who are you?" he said again. The figure slipped between stalls with quiet certainty, a glint of something metallic at her side. Before he could step closer, a door at the far end clicked shut. By the time Pennington pushed it open, the cloister beyond was empty, but for a draught of cold air that smelled of candle wax and, oddly, brass polish. He did not pursue. Instead, he locked the door, returned to the vestry, and telephoned the police station, where Sergeant Malley was trying to complete a crossword before the shift ended. "A nun?" Malley repeated, pencil hovering. "At midnight?" "That's what I said. Was she singing?" Pennington hesitated. "Yes, beautifully, but—" He could not quite explain the unease that had settled in the church like leftover incense. "She should not have been there. We don't have any nuns attached to St. Jude's." Malley wrote something down and promised to inform Inspector Purbright in the morning. He did not mention that he had already heard about the singing from his cousin, who had heard it from the milk lorry driver's sister's friend. At 8:30 the next morning, Purbright himself stood in the porch of St. Jude's, hat in hand, eyes wandering over the damp stonework as though reading a newspaper printed in lichen. He had not come in haste. Midnight singers rarely obliged by remaining on the premises. But he had come, which in Flaxford was enough to start a small avalanche of conjecture. The vicar met him with coffee and an apology for the lack of biscuits. They walked together into the nave. Sunlight poured through the stained glass, turning the night's shadows into polite patches of colour. "She stood there," Pennington said, pointing to the choir stalls. "I think she was a nun. A tall one." "And she left through that door." Purbright's gaze moved from the stalls to the door, to the brass candle holder near the altar. A faint smudge on the holder's base caught his attention, wax rubbed away as if a hand had steadied itself. "He said nothing. Nothing was taken." "Nothing I can see." But the harmonium's bellows were still warm. Purbright made a small sound that might have been agreement or indigestion. He asked about keys, about visitors, about Sister Magdalene, who was known for late-night prayers but not for singing. Each question was delivered as if it were an afterthought, each answer stored away behind his mild expression. When he left, Purbright did not go straight back to the station. He walked instead to the tea shop opposite the post office, where the milk lorry driver's sister was already telling a friend about the phantom nun. The inspector ordered a scone, listened, and gazed out of the window at the quiet market square, which was about to become rather less quiet. By breakfast time, the phantom nun had become the only topic on Market Hill worth discussing, eclipsing even the perennial grievances about refuse collection and the price of kippers. A patch of sunlight on the cobbles outside Mrs. Dallow's tea shop acted as a kind of informal forum where customers drifted out after their tea to exchange snippets. No one claimed to have actually seen the figure except the vicar, but that only improved the tale. In Flaxford, proof was often an impediment to a good story. Mrs. Dallow herself had already woven the incident into a richer tapestry. By 9 o'clock she was telling her regulars that the nun had been heard chanting not Latin, but some older, darker tongue, perhaps Welsh. By 10, the chant had become a confession, and by 10:30, a prophecy of doom, which one of the town's amateur dramatists considered a nice touch. Opposite the tea shop stood a shop that sold umbrellas and shoe polish, run by a Mr. Harbottle whose temperament was as neat as his window displays. Harbottle claimed to have heard nothing the previous night but a cat fight. Nevertheless, he was not above leaning in the doorway to listen, his eyebrows suggesting disbelief but his ears suggesting otherwise. A little further along the pavement, Mrs. Wibsey from the post office held court with her sister, the milk lorry driver's informant, and 2 pensioners who had once been in the church choir and now saw the mystery as a personal slight. They spoke in low tones as if the nun might be under the counter with the stamps. "She must be from the convent school," said Mrs. Wibsey, "sneaking out to practice her singing." Her sister shook her head. "They don't allow it after 9. And anyway, Sister Magdalene locks the music room. Perhaps she's a ghost," offered one of the pensioners. "We had that curate who died of pneumonia in 38. He had a high voice." The group fell silent for a moment, considering the possibility. In Flaxford, ghosts were only slightly less plausible than late-night nuns. While the town hummed with conjecture, Inspector Purbright sat in his office at the police station, which smelled faintly of damp files and Sergeant Malley's aftershave. He had the parish newsletter spread before him like a map of minor grievances. The vicar's proofs contained nothing obviously seditious, no notes about hidden treasure, no appeals for missing relics. Yet Purbright's attention lingered on a small notice at the bottom. Upcoming council meeting to discuss proposed sale of church-owned land. He underlined it with his pencil, not because he had reached a conclusion, but because habit had taught him that church music and property disputes often sang from the same hymn sheet, Sergeant. Malley came in with a mug of tea and the air of a man who had learned something before anyone else. "So Mrs. Dallow says the nun was carrying a chalice." Purbright looked up mildly. "A chalice? That's what she told Mrs. Wibsey, who told her sister, who told me." "It's all over the Market Hill. Some say it was gold, others say brass. One fellow says it glowed." "That is a busy chalice," Purbright said dryly. "Did anyone actually see it?" "No, sir." "Then perhaps it's best to wait before issuing a description." Malley nodded, a little disappointed. Gossip was easier to manage when it could be written down like an inventory. Purbright rose, took his hat, and suggested a walk. They left the station and strolled toward the square, the inspector's pace unhurried as if they were on their way to a particularly dull lecture. As they passed Mrs. Dallow's shop, the murmur of speculation flowed around them like a tide. People lowered their voices, but not enough to prevent the police from hearing. Purbright smiled slightly at the effort. Outside the post office, he paused to examine a public notice about lost property. 3 umbrellas, a bicycle, and a ferret named Percy. Then he asked, As if thinking aloud, "Mally, who benefits from a nun singing at midnight?" Mally blinked. "Benefits, sir?" "Yes, it's an unusual form of advertising, but perhaps effective. I'd say it scares more than it sells." Quite, Purbright. Eyes drifted across the square to the spire of St. Jude's and beyond it to the grey bulk of the convent, school tucked behind its high wall. Still, it draws attention. They resumed their walk, heading up a narrow lane where ivy sagged over garden gates. The lane ended at a small yard used by delivery vans and gossiping porters. Here Purbright encountered Aubrey Frimble, the organist, who was arguing with a delivery man about a crate of hymnals. Frimble turned a deep shade of moral outrage on seeing the inspector. "I hope you are taking this matter seriously," he said. "I have the only key to the organ loft." "The implication is obvious." "Not necessarily," Purbright replied. "Locks, like consciences, can be picked." Frimble bristled but said no more. Purbright thanked him and moved on, making a mental note about the crate of hymnals and the delivery time. The harmonium's bellows, after all, had still been warm when the vicar found them. At noon, the square's bells clanged for the Angelus, and the town's speculation took a lunch break. Purbright and Mally returned to the station. On his desk lay a slip of paper from the telephone exchange. Sister Magdalene had rung to say she wished to speak to him privately about the events of the night. Purbright tapped the paper with his finger. "Ah, the singing nun wishes an audience." "She didn't say she was the singer, sir," Mally pointed out. "No," Purbright agreed. "But she may know the tune." He looked at the parish newsletter again, at the small notice about the proposed sale of church-owned land. Then he looked out of the window at the square, where Mrs. Dallow was telling a new group of customers that the nun had worn silver slippers. Purbright smiled faintly. The town, he thought, would supply him with every possible motive and none of the facts. But that was all right. People revealed more of themselves in speculation than in statements. He put on his hat once more, preparing for his visit to the convent school. "Mally," he said, "have you ever noticed how a whisper grows louder than a shout?" "Yes, sir." "Then let's go listen to some whispers." They left the station, stepping into the bright midday sun. Above them, the spire of St. Jude's gleamed like a needle against the sky, and somewhere behind its walls a woman's voice began, soft, tentative, and unmistakably the same hymn from the night before. Mally stiffened, but Purbright merely tilted his head, as though listening for an off-key note in an otherwise pleasant tune. The convent school of St. Agnes stood at the far edge of Flaxford, where the pavements gave up and the hedgerows began. High brick walls, streaked with moss and rain, surrounded its grounds like an admonition. Over the arched gateway hung a weathered carving of the Virgin holding a book whose script had been blurred by decades of drizzle. A small brass plate politely reminded visitors to ring and wait. Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Mally arrived just after the midday bell. Children's voices floated over the wall, sing-song rhymes and the occasional shriek of rebellion quickly suppressed. Purbright pressed the bell and listened to the answering buzz as if it were a note in a piece of music. A young lay sister opened the gate. She had an expression of mild alarm, as if expecting the police to confiscate her chalk. Purbright greeted her gently, hat in hand, and explained that he had an appointment with Sister Magdalene. The sister led them through a gravel path flanked by lilac bushes to a modest reception room that smelled faintly of furniture polish and boiled cabbage. She offered them tea. Purbright accepted with quiet thanks, Mally with visible relief. Sister Magdalene entered a few minutes later. She was tall, spare, and moved like a candle flame in a draught, quick flickers of composure. Her veil framed a face that might once have been striking, but was now smoothed by duty into calm lines. She shook Purbright's hand with the firmness of someone used to corralling wayward pupils. "Inspector," she said, "I fear this business at St. Jude's has caused a great deal of talk." "Talk," Purbright said, "is Flaxford's preferred form of exercise. Please sit down. She obeyed, folding her hands neatly on the table. I am concerned because some of that talk points to us. To me, in fact. Purbright poured his tea slowly. Because you are known for late-night prayers. She gave a small smile. And because I have a voice, apparently. The girls sometimes hear me in the chapel. They exaggerate. Were you at St. Jude's last night? No, we keep strict hours. The gates are locked at 9:30, the chapel at 10.
I was in my room reading. Alone?
Yes. Her eyes met his without flinching, but there was a flicker of irritation or fatigue that did not escape him. Mally asked about keys to the music room and the convent's own harmonium. Sister Magdalene explained that only she and the Mother Superior held them.
But then nothing is missing here, she added.
We did inventory this morning. Purbright sipped his tea.
Sister, might any of your staff have had reason to visit St. Jude's?
A rehearsal? A meeting, perhaps? She hesitated. Our choir mistress, Miss Crail, occasionally plays at parish events, but she is away in Derby visiting her mother. And the girls? They are not permitted outside after dusk without a chaperone. The inspector nodded. Nevertheless, someone in a habit was singing in St. Jude's at midnight. That is a fact, or at least a firmly held belief. His tone was mild. His eyes were attentive. Sister Magdalene looked down at her hands. It may have been someone dressing up, she said finally. Our costumes for the saints' pageant are stored in a cupboard near the back gate.
It is possible,
she trailed off. Possible, Purbright repeated softly, as though tasting the word. The Mother Superior entered then, a small woman, with a large crucifix and an expression of polite impatience. She greeted Purbright, offered him another biscuit, and declared in a voice like iron filings that no nun of St. Agnes had been out at midnight, singing or otherwise. We are not that sort of order, she said. Contemplation is our business. Purbright inclined his head. I understand. Still, appearances can be misleading, can they not? Appearances, she said, are for worldly people. With that, she excused herself to oversee lunch. When she had gone, Sister Magdalene exhaled as if she had been holding her breath. She is worried, she murmured. Our reputation matters. We are not rich. If the council sells the church land, our lease on the small field for our kitchen garden may be withdrawn. We depend on that. Purbright said quietly. The kitchen garden. A bell rang somewhere and the children's voices began again, this time a hymn tune, faltering, then gathering strength. Purbright rose.
Thank you, sister.
You have been helpful. At the door, she stopped him. Inspector, if someone is trying to harm our order's name, you will be discreet? I find discretion more effective than its opposite, he said. They walked back along the gravel path. Mally, who had been silent through most of the interview, asked as they reached the gate, Do you believe her, sir?
I believe she has a garden, Purbright said.
And a problem. On the pavement outside the convent they met Councillor Tudge, a red-faced man whose suit looked as though it had been tailored from committee minutes. He greeted Purbright with hearty surprise.
Inspector, heard you're on the trail of the midnight minstrel. I should think it's some silly prank. Possibly, Purbright said. Tudge lowered his voice conspiratorially.
There's a lot of money tied up in that church property, you know.
I'm pushing for a new car park.
Not that the convent will like it, he chuckled. They'll sing louder hymns to stop it. Purbright smiled politely. You have a lively sense of humour, Councillor. Yes, well. Tudge glanced at the convent gate. Just don't let them blame me if their nuns go wandering. He strode off, leaving behind a faint scent of hair tonic and civic ambition. Mally watched him go. He's cheerful. Cheerfulness, Purbright said, is often a sign of someone who thinks he's ahead of the hymn sheet. They strolled back toward town, taking a shortcut through a lane lined with elder trees. The inspector's pace slowed as he noticed a small object lying near the curb, a devotional book, its cover scuffed, pages marked with slips of paper. He picked it up carefully. Inside the flyleaf was a faint, penciled name. M. Crail. The choir mistress, Mally said. Yes. Purbright closed the book. Supposed to be in Derby, they resumed walking. A delivery van passed them heading toward the convent. On its side was painted Frimble & Co. Musical Supplies, a connection Purbright did not comment on aloud. Instead, he slipped the book into his coat pocket and looked up at the spire of St. Jude's visible across the fields.
As if it were a metronome ticking out the town's pulse. "Mally," he said mildly.
"How good are you at listening to choirs?" "Tone deaf, sir?" "Excellent. We shall go to the vicarage this evening. I want to hear the hymn again, exactly as it sounded last night." Mally gave him a puzzled look, but said nothing. He had learned that Purbright's apparent non-sequiturs usually led somewhere, though never by the direct route. Behind them, the convent bell rang for afternoon lessons. Ahead, the market square shimmered in the mild sun, full of shoppers who had already turned the phantom nun into a dozen different characters, each more interesting than the last. Purbright walked on, his face unreadable, but his fingers tapped lightly on the devotional book as though keeping time with a tune only he could hear. By the following morning, Sister Magdalene had become the town's most convenient answer to an inconvenient mystery. Her name appeared, cautiously but unmistakably, in the Flaxford Gazette under the headline, "Midnight Singer Linked to Convent Figure." The question mark was large enough to be mistaken for a halo, yet the implication was plain. The article hinted at late-night devotions and unorthodox musical practices without printing anything actionable. It ended with a flourish about the mystery woman's voice echoing through St. Jude's like a plea for lost souls, which Mrs. Dallow read aloud to her customers with relish. Councillor Tudge, who considered himself both guardian of public morality and champion of civic progress, was quoted saying, "While I do not wish to cast aspersions on any religious institution, the police must act swiftly to reassure the public." It was, he thought, a fine sentence, and he repeated it later in the Market Hill Café for the benefit of anyone who had missed it in print. He added privately that the sooner the convent's lease on the kitchen garden was terminated, the sooner Flaxford could have its much-needed car park. In the tea shop, speculation hardened into certainty. Mrs. Wibsey declared that she had always suspected Sister Magdalene of peculiar tendencies, though she could not specify what they were. Harbottle from the umbrella shop confided that he had once heard her singing a secular tune, an Ave Maria arrangement, played on the wireless, and had found it too operatic by
half. Even the milk lorry driver's sister nodded gravely, as if she had been present at every rehearsal.
Mid-morning, Sergeant Mally was fielding calls at the station from parishioners demanding action. One elderly lady insisted that a nun had knocked over her geraniums during the night. Another reported seeing a veiled figure at the bus stop reading a racing paper. Mally dutifully wrote down each claim. Though his pencil grew weary, Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, sat at his desk examining the devotional book marked M. Crail. He had sent a discreet inquiry to Derby to confirm Miss Crail's visit to her mother. The answer had not yet arrived. He flipped through the book's pages, noting the slips of paper marking certain hymns, one of them the very tunes sung at midnight. He closed it and placed it beside the parish newsletter, whose small notice about the churchland seemed to grow heavier by the hour. Mally entered with a stack of newspapers. "So the Gazette's done a piece. They're practically naming Sister Magdalene." Purbright lifted an eyebrow.
"How practical of them. Council's upset."
Councillor Tudge rang to say he hopes we'll clear this up before the next meeting. "Does he indeed?" Purbright reached for his hat. "Let's go see how our suspect is faring." The convent reception room felt cooler than on their previous visit. Sister Magdalene sat stiffly at the table, a copy of the Gazette folded before her like an accusation. She rose when Purbright entered, composure fraying at the edges. "You've seen it?" she asked. "I have. They are saying I was at St. Jude's." "They are saying many things," Purbright replied gently. "That is their nature. I was here all night."
"I told you, yes?" He studied her face a moment longer.
May I ask, does Miss Crail have access to costumes from your pageant cupboard? She does, of course. She supervises it. Has anything been taken? We haven't checked today. A faint flush rose in her cheeks.
Inspector, do you suspect her? I suspect possibility, he said.
It's a habit of mine. She drew a breath. The Mother Superior thinks I have brought disgrace on us. The council will use this to take our field. That garden feeds our kitchen. Purbright's expression remained mild, but Mally saw his fingers drum once on the arm of the chair, as though striking a silent chord. Sister, he said softly, have you told anyone of your worries about the land? Only Miss Crail. She handles our correspondence. Purbright inclined his head. Then you mustn't be surprised if rumours grow fertile. Worries often plant seeds in other minds. She looked at him sharply, then lowered her gaze. What will you do? Listen, he said. It's what the town has already been doing, only less selectively. They left the convent and walked back toward the square. On the way, Mally ventured, She's frightened, sir.
But she seems truthful. She is frightened, Purbright agreed.
Truthful is another matter. People can tell the truth and still leave out the part that matters. In the square, the market stalls were up, bright with early strawberries and dubious bargains. Councillor Tudge held forth near the fountain to a knot of reporters, expounding on the need for transparent inquiry. He saw Purbright and waved him over with the air of a man greeting his own footnote. "Inspector," he boomed, "I hope you're making progress. The town won't tolerate ecclesiastical mysteries." "I shall do my best," Purbright said. Tudge lowered his voice. "Between you and me, that Sister Magdalene is a bit high-handed.
Always writing letters about planning permissions.
Wouldn't surprise me if she thought midnight singing would rally sympathy, would it?" Purbright asked mildly. "Well, publicity's a powerful thing." Tudge smiled the smile of a man who had commissioned several leaflets. "Anyway, the press is on your side. Clear it up quickly and we can move on to constructive developments." Purbright thanked him and moved on. As they walked away, Mally muttered, "He's practically written a confession." "Convenience," Purbright said, "is a poor substitute for evidence, but it fills column inches." Back at the station, he found a reply from Darby waiting. Miss Crail had indeed arrived at her mother's, but left again unexpectedly 2 days ago for professional reasons. No further details. Purbright placed the letter beside the devotional book and studied them both as though they were lines in a musical score whose refrain he had almost grasped. He rose and looked out of the window at the square. The sun caught the spire of St. Jude's and flashed briefly like a signal. Below, Mrs. Dallow was telling 2 tourists that the singing nun had predicted an earthquake. Purbright smiled faintly. In Flaxford, he reflected, facts travelled second class while rumours rode first. He sat down again, reached for his notebook, and wrote a single line. "Who profits from a scandal at midnight?" Then he underlined it twice, not because he had reached a conclusion, but because the tune was becoming familiar. The devotional book lay on Purbright's desk with the wary air of something used beyond kindness. Black cloth rubbed pale at the corners. The flyleaf bore M. Crail in firm pencil, once rubbed, never erased. A flat sprig of rosemary slid out when he opened it, remembrance reduced to crisp leaf. Inside, a folded slip from a bus timetable, Derby Flaxford, evenings only. Another marker sat at the hymn heard at St. Jude's, with a neat pencil note. "Better from loft. Bellows wheeze below." The pages smelt faintly of brass polish, not incense. Sergeant Mally hovered.
"Evidence, sir?"
"A habit with a memory," said Purbright. Farther on, a rectangle from the Flaxford Gazette had been tucked, the council's notice about sale of church land. In the margin, someone had darkened a tiny triangle into an arrow, not under sale, but under rezoning for vehicular access. Purbright tapped it. "The car park needs a mouth," he murmured. Through a wall or a garden they went to the vicarage. Reverend Pennington, smelling of eggs and ink, ushered them into a study 2 days before tidy. Purbright showed the note about the loft. Miss Crail keeps practical notes, Pennington admitted. Mr. Frimble hates the harmonium. The loft pedals stick.
Views are exchanged. She plays here often.
Special services. Briskly devout. Brass polish? We did the candle holders yesterday. Harbottle's Lustermaster. It travels. They crossed to Harbottle's Umbrellas and Polish Museum. The proprietor sniffed the devotional book like a sommelier. Lustermaster, he said. Half the town, St. Jude's by the tin. Do customers polish keys? Purbright asked. Some polish anything they can catch. Duty wrestled with discretion. Discretion yielded. A lady bought a tin 2 evenings ago, asked for cotton gloves, said brass stains, plus hat pins and rubber door wedges, veil, not nun length. Name? Respectable people rarely give one, Harbottle said, pleased with himself. Outside, Mally said, Miss Crail wears a hat. So do several other persons, Purbright replied. Let us remain ill-informed a little longer. At the parish hall, the caretaker, a man who rationed syllables, unlocked the stage cupboard. Among moth-bitten cassocks hung 3 pageant habits, one longer than the rest. A box marked props, chalice, brass, veils, runes, school play, held a dull chalice, 2 short veils, and at the bottom a handful of rubber wedges. A pencil stub lay with a triangular bite in its wood. Who has access?
Purbright asked Crail. Magdalene, the caretaker said, economical as his key ring. Back at the station, the devotional book lay open on the blotter.
As Purbright turned it, a tiny brass shaving worked loose from the inner hinge and glittered like a comma. He nudged it with his pen. Key cutting, he said. Mally stared. Sir, Frimble and Combs style themselves musical supplies and repairs, Purbright said. Repairs invite metal filings. A person carrying a pattern for the loft key might press it flat in a book. Brass leaves crumbs where fingers do not notice. So Miss Crail had a duplicate made? Or a borrower of her book did? Pronouns are treacherous, he leafed back to the hymn. Above the stave a faint second note hovered. Lady Chapel, best echo at stone step. Stand just inside screen. He closed the book and looked out at the square. The council notice had multiplied in shop windows. Councillor Tudge's smile had acquired the glaze of a man practising victory. Sir, Mally said, if someone wanted a car park, why sing at midnight? Make piety argue with property, Purbright said. A quarrel gathers a crowd, and a crowd notices notices. Toward evening they returned to St. Jude's with the book. The nave held flowers and the day's polish. Pale light printed squares on the flags. Purbright stood with his toe on the Lady Chapel's first stone step and hummed the hymn. The sound sharpened, slipped around the screen, and came back private. 2 strides away lay the cloister door. Beyond it, an alley ran to Market Hill. One could sing, vanish, reappear as rumour. He looked up at the loft. The organ console sat under its dust cover like a guarded patient. The harmonium, wheeled back to its niche, showed a faint smear of polish on the handle. He ran a finger along it and held up the sheen. Mr. Harbottle's export, he said. Across the aisle, a framed memorial of polished glass reflected the choir stalls and their shadows. Candlelight would flare in that glass and hide any small movement near the screen. Without candles, the glass would obediently show it.
A little thing.
Useful to someone who liked rehearsed effects. What are we looking for, sir? Mally whispered. A reason for trivialities to agree, Purbright said. A timetable scrap, a shaded arrow, door wedges, a shaving that betrayed its file. Little things form choirs, Sergeant. They only need someone to give them a note. They stepped into the cloister. A draught lifted the book's page edges. He pressed them flat, closing his hand over the hymn as one might quiet a sparrow. Sir? Later, he said. We shall ask Mr. Frimble about repairs.
And Miss Crail about the convenience of short veils. On Market Hill, the Gazette promised cheerful headlines for the morning.
Purbright, who preferred footnotes, walked back to the station with the book held lightly, as if it might sing again. The brass smell had already faded to memory. He sat and wrote a single line in his notebook. Who used a devout object to carry a profane pattern? And underlined it once. Not because he knew, but because the tune was coming round. The nave of St. Jude's smelt of polish and fresh flowers when Inspector Purbright arrived the next morning. Sunlight poured through the clear-story windows in strips, illuminating dust motes that drifted like quiet applause. From above came the hesitant wheeze of pipes, someone testing the organ as though afraid it might object. Aubrey Frimble, organist and self-appointed guardian of sacred acoustics, emerged from the loft stairs, wiping his hands on a velvet cloth. His moustache bristled with injury at the intrusion. "Inspector," he said, "I was about to recalibrate the pedals. The last player left them like a tram line." "You mean Miss Crail?" "Who else? She insists on rehearsing when I'm not here." "Some people think an organ is a piano with delusions." Purbright looked up at the loft.
"Your key is still in your pocket."
"Always." Frimble patted it like a medal. "But there are duplicates. They've had that loft for pageants since before the war." "The lock's an old joke. Jokes are popular in Flaxford," Purbright said mildly. "Who has permission?"
"Officially, only me and the parish secretary. Unofficially, anyone who knows where the spare hangs." "Where does it hang?"
Frimble flushed. "In the vestry cupboard."
"Marked music," Purbright nodded. "Could you show me?"
Frimble led him to the vestry, where a row of hooks bore keys labelled in fading ink. One indeed said music. Purbright held it up. "Easily borrowed," he said. "Easily returned," the organist bristled. "I'm not responsible for nuns after hours." "No," Purbright said, "but you are responsible for sound. Tell me, if one wished to sing unseen, where would one stand?" Frimble's irritation softened into professional pride. "Between the second and third stalls under the loft. The echo folds back under the arch." "You sound like a choir of one," Purbright thanked him. As he left, he noticed a faint smear of brass polish on the loft rail. The polish travelled well. In the parish office across the square, he found Miss Etheridge, the parish secretary, seated at a desk like a small battleship. She wore spectacles that magnified her eyes and an expression that discouraged misprints. "You've come about Sister Magdalene," she said, before he could speak. "Everyone does. I've come about keys," Purbright said. "Who signs them out?" "We don't sign them out, Inspector. We're a parish, not a bank." "Then who last used the loft?" She opened a ledger with the satisfaction of a conjurer producing a rabbit. "Miss Crail rehearsed on Tuesday afternoon." "No one since?" "Until Wednesday midnight," Purbright murmured. Miss Etheridge sniffed. "You'll not pin this on me. I was at my sister's in Swinstead. I can produce witnesses."
"As for Sister Magdalene, she's a good woman but far too tolerant."
"Those pageant costumes should have been burned years ago."
"Invite Temptation, you get theatricals." "Temptation and theatricals often share a stage," Purbright said. "Who manages the hall bookings?" "I do." "Who pays the insurance on the hall?"
"The council," he smiled.
"Thank you."
"You've been very clear." From the parish office he walked to the council house where Councillor Crispin Blake, chair of the Development Committee, was holding a press conference in miniature. 2 reporters, 1 photographer, and his own reflection in a glass case. Blakey was younger than Tudge, better dressed, and radiated the confidence of a man who could turn even hymnals into revenue. "Inspector," he said warmly, "if you've come about the singing nun, I can assure you the council takes no sides, though naturally we're concerned about security." "You're concerned about the sale of church land," Purbright said gently. Blake chuckled. "We prefer reallocation for public use. The convent's kitchen plot is hardly sacred ground, yet very useful to them. They can grow vegetables elsewhere. Flaxford needs parking."
"Visitors can't find a space for the Sunday market." "Public benefit, Inspector."
"Always the public benefit," Purbright studied him. "Did you attend the midnight rehearsal?"
"But good heavens, no. I was at a dinner with the Rotary," he smiled. "Ask anyone." Purbright did not ask. Instead, he said, You know Miss Crail?"
"Only by reputation. Talented but temperamental. Why?" Because reputations interest me, Purbright said. Blake spread his hands. And you'll know how quickly they can be ruined. Look at Sister Magdalene. She's probably innocent, but the papers love a habit. Yes, Purbright said. Habits make good headlines. He left Blake to his reporters and crossed back to St. Jude's. Mally met him at the porch, holding a small paper bag. Found this under the loft stairs, sir. Cotton gloves, brass smudged.
Harbottle's price sticker's still on. Purbright took 'em.
Purchased 2 evenings ago?
So he says. They entered the nave.
The afternoon sun made the stained glass blaze like a warning. Purbright climbed the loft stairs slowly, Mally behind. At the console he placed the gloves on the rail. Brass polish glimmered faintly on the keys. Sir, Mally said, if Miss Crale's in Derby, who wore these? A question with a familiar tune, Purbright murmured. He looked over the rail at the choir stalls. From this height, one could see the Lady Chapel step, the cloister door, and, reflected in a memorial plaque, the angle from which a photographer might catch a veiled figure slipping away. It would take planning, but planning had been done. He descended, hat in hand. Sergeant, make quiet inquiries about Miss Crale's movements. Also about Councillor Blake's dinner.
And keep an ear on Tudge. The field behind the convent may be more crowded than the choir. Yes, sir. They stepped into the square.
Gossip swirled like pigeons at crumbs. Mrs. Dallow told a pair of tourists that the nun had sung The Last Post. Harbottle was polishing his window frames with unnecessary vigour. Councillor Tudge, across the way, pretended to examine a display of hymnals while speaking into a reporter's ear. Purbright paused. The smell of brass polish, faint but definite, came from the gloves in his pocket. A trivial detail, yet it clung as stubbornly as rumour. He glanced up at the spire and thought of Miss Crale's pencilled note. Better from loft. Bellows wheeze below. Better from loft indeed, for singing, for vanishing, for planting suspicion. Sergeant, he said, Flaxford has many keys and few locks. But voices leave echoes. Mally gave him a puzzled look. Meaning, sir? Meaning, Purbright said mildly, that the next verse is about to begin. They walked on, the square behind them buzzing with its own chorus, and in his coat pocket the gloves and the devotional book lay side by side like props awaiting their cue. The vicarage garden, ordinarily a refuge of begonias and polite applause, had been pressed into duty for the annual church fete. Reverend Pennington, armed with a tray of raffle tickets, had declared the day's theme harmony and fellowship, though the mood leaned toward gossip and sponge cake. Flaxford citizens circulated among stalls of jam, bric-a-brac, and faded hymnals. Their conversation tuned inevitably to the mystery of the singing nun. Inspector Purbright attended in his usual capacity, outwardly sociable, inwardly detached. He accepted a cup of tepid lemonade, listened to Mrs. Wibbsey's theory that the apparition was Sister Magdalene rehearsing for a secret ordination, and responded only with the sort of smile that could be interpreted as agreement or mere politeness. Sergeant Mally shadowed him with a meat pie and an air of anticipation. The garden shimmered in the warm afternoon light. Behind the trestle tables, children ran sack races while their mothers compared notes on hymn tunes. Councillor Tudge stood by the tombola, holding forth about the council's bold initiative for modern parking facilities. Councillor Blake, more discreet, hovered near the cake stall, distributing handshakes like raffle tickets. The fete reached its height when the parish choir assembled on the vicarage steps to perform a selection of hymns. Mr. Frimble conducted with solemn relish, moustache twitching like a metronome. The voices rose in uneven harmony, but the crowd applauded dutifully. Then, just as Frimble launched into a second verse, a new voice rang out, clear, high, and startlingly beautiful. It was the same hymn that had drifted through St. Jude's at midnight. The effect was electric. The choir faltered. Mrs. Dallow dropped her knitting, Councillor Tudge's face turned the colour of strawberry preserve.
All eyes turned toward the orchard at the edge of the garden, where the voice seemed to float among the branches. Several children squealed.
A few ladies crossed themselves. Someone whispered, "She's here." Purbright set down his lemonade. He moved toward the orchard with his unhurried gait, Mally scrambling behind. The singing continued unbroken, then ceased on a long, echoing note. By the time they reached the trees, the only movement was a blackbird startled into flight. "Gone," Mally muttered. Purbright studied the ground. The grass showed the faint crush of recent footsteps leading to the side gate. A cotton glove lay half hidden under nettles, smudged with brass polish. He picked it up carefully. Back in the garden, the fate had dissolved into confusion. Mrs. Wibsey declared it proof that Sister Magdalen could not restrain her nocturnal habits. Councillor Tudge called loudly for an official inquiry. Frimble sputtered that his choir had been sabotaged. Purbright rejoined them with his mildest expression.
"An impressive solo," he said, "from a nun,"
Tudge thundered.
"At my fate." "At the vicar's fate," Purbright corrected gently.
And not necessarily a nun. A voice in a habit, perhaps. The orchard is not a cloister. Sister Magdalen herself was present, managing a stall of preserves. She looked stricken, though not surprised.
"Inspector, I was here all the time," she said quickly.
Ask anyone. Several parishioners confirmed it. She had not left her stall. The accusation, so ready on many lips, faltered. Purbright inclined his head. Then the voice belonged to someone else. The Mother Superior, who had appeared like a small storm cloud, snapped, "Of course it did."
"My sisters do not perform theatricals in orchards," Tudge bristled.
Nevertheless, the council must consider security. Public land cannot be subject to haunting. Blake intervened smoothly. What Councillor Tudge means is that uncertainty benefits no one. The mystery must be solved for the good of parish and council alike. Purbright looked from one councillor to the other. "Indeed," he said. "But haste often selects the wrong soloist." The fate stumbled on, though conversation now outpaced the raffle. By dusk the stalls were dismantled, the jam jars packed away, and the citizens returned to their homes, laden with gossip and dubious prizes. In the quiet that followed, Purbright walked with Mally along the orchard path again. He examined the side gate. The latch bore faint scratches, fresh, as if opened in haste. Beyond lay a narrow lane leading toward the parish hall. Could Sister Magdalen have slipped away?
Mally asked. "Not without leaving an echo behind," Purbright replied.
The crowd watched her. They wanted her guilty. That is why she could not be. Then who? Purbright considered the glove in his pocket. Someone who knows the hymn, has access to a habit, and enjoys theatre. Someone who profits from doubt. They returned to the station where the devotional book still lay on the inspector's desk. He placed the new glove beside it. Two props in a performance that had chosen its stage carefully. Late that evening he wrote a brief note in his pocketbook. Second incident removes Magdalen. Pattern continues. He underlined it once, then closed the book. Outside, the town settled into its usual drowsy order, yet the echo of that orchard voice lingered, unnerving in its clarity. For the first time, the townsfolk's certainty had wavered. Their chosen suspect was slipping free, and suspicion, once unmoored, would float toward other names. Purbright knew Flaxford would oblige him with candidates enough. The river Fleam curled lazily beneath Flaxford's old stone bridge, carrying leaves, crumbs of bread, and the odd scrap of municipal ambition. Mid-afternoon sunlight glinted on its ripples like a string of misplaced coins. Inspector Purbright stood at the parapet with a paper bag of crumbs, feeding the town's ducks and his own thoughts with equal calm. Across the water, the convent's kitchen garden lay hidden behind brick and ivy, yet he could picture it precisely. Neat rows of beans, a little greenhouse with panes like spectacles, soil dark with patient labour. Sister Magdalen had spoken of it without flourish, but with the understated pride of someone who could coax nourishment from stubborn ground. Purbright tossed another crumb to the ducks. They jostled politely, a choreography of appetite disguised as civility. On the bridge, a few townspeople passed, slowing to nod at the inspector as though proximity to him might confer immunity from rumour. Mrs. Dallow's husband ambled by with a fishing rod, offering a greeting so tentative it might have been a question. Purbright answered with a small smile and turned back to the water. The ducks accepted his bread with more honesty than most suspects. He thought of Sister Magdalen's lined face at the fete, trapped in the centre of speculation like a pinned moth. Respectability, he reflected, was Flaxford's favourite costume. Everyone wore it. Few paid for the fitting. It could be invoked to defend the innocent or accuse them, depending on the day's weather. And yet the same town that whispered about Magdalen's habits relied on her kitchen garden's produce for the harvest supper. Charity and suspicion often shared a table. A breeze lifted from the river, carrying the smell of damp stone and faint polish from a moored skiff. Purbright broke another crust, watching the ducks swirl into eddies like small councils arguing over procedure. Councillor Tudge had thundered at the fete. Councillor Blake had smiled like a man counting invisible coins. Both wanted the convent's field, though each wrapped his desire in different hymns, one of public order, the other of public benefit. Neither tune rang quite true. Behind the councillors stood Miss Crail, absent yet present, her devotional book on his desk like an unclaimed parcel. He imagined her penciling those cryptic notes about bellows and echoes, practical instructions or stage directions. The bus ticket scrap suggested a journey, but not which way it ran. She had the skill, the costumes, and perhaps the motive. But motive was a shy fish. It surfaced only when the water lay still. Purbright scattered crumbs in a long arc. Ducks dashed after them, their reflections breaking into ripples. In the water's shifting mirror he glimpsed his own face, mild and unreadable. It was a useful face for a policeman in a town where everyone thought they knew everyone else. They never quite knew him. That allowed him to listen longer than they realized. From the opposite bank came the sound of children from the convent on their afternoon walk, supervised by a brisk young sister. Their laughter floated across like a hymn with no words. Purbright watched them file past the garden gate. The gate latch gleamed, recently oiled. A trivial observation, but he stored it anyway. Little things kept time better than big speeches. Mally approached from the high street, balancing 2 paper cups of tea. He handed one over and leaned on the parapet. "Peaceful spot, sir," he said. "Peaceful appearance," Purbright corrected gently. "Rivers carry all sorts under the surface," Mally sipped. "You think Sister Magdalene's off the hook now?" "She was never on it," Purbright said. "But hooks can be baited to catch more than fish. Whoever sang at the fete wanted her exonerated as much as accused, wanted the town confused. Why? Because confusion stalls decisions. A council reluctant to move on a sale is easier to steer." He flicked the last crumb into the water.
"Our midnight chorister may be less a ghost than a strategist," Mally frowned.
"So who gains?" "That," Purbright said mildly, "is what the ducks are telling me." He watched a drake elbow its way to the crust, then drift back, satisfied. Observe, one seizes the bread, another distracts, a third benefits from the scraps. Respectability on the surface, hidden bargains below. "Flaxford in feathers," Mally chuckled. "Do you always solve cases by feeding ducks?" "Ducks are more candid than committees." They stood in companionable silence a while, listening to the water's low murmur. Across the bridge a barrow of hymn books rattled past, pushed by a parish volunteer. Purbright's eyes followed it, noting the route, from Parish Hall to St. Jude's. Same path a veiled figure might take, slipping from orchard to loft. He asked quietly, "Sergeant, when did Miss Crail last direct the choir at a fete?" 2 years ago, sir. She resigned to focus on teaching. Yet she left Derby 2 days before this fete?" "Yes, sir." Purbright finished his tea. "We shall speak to her presently, but not yet."
A tune unfinished loses its power.
We must let her think she has an encore. He turned his gaze back to the river. The children's voices had faded. Only the ducks remained, circling with patient greed. He felt the faintest smile tug at his mouth. Human nature was rarely mysterious, only its staging. Mally said, if she planned all this, she's clever. Clever enough to use Sister Magdalene as a decoy, Purbright said softly. Clever enough to know that Flaxford loves a scandal but dislikes a decision. He set the empty cup on the parapet. I'll come, Sergeant. We'll pay Mr. Frimble another visit. I want to see his repair invoices. As they walked off the bridge, the inspector glanced once more at the water. The crumbs had vanished. The ripples were smoothing back into a mirror. In that calm surface he imagined the town's faces, pious, curious, self-assured, waiting for the next note. He would give it to them soon, but in his own tempo. The parish hall still smelt faintly of stale tea and hymnals when Inspector Purbright arrived that evening. Chairs were stacked at the sides like dozing parishioners. Only a handful of people remained after the committee meeting. Sister Magdalene, pale but steady, Mr. Frimble packing away his music folders, Miss Etheridge fussing over a ledger, and Councillors Tudge and Blake comparing notes in the corner. It was an unremarkable scene, precisely the kind Purbright favoured for a test. He had asked Sergeant Mally to linger near the door with a clipboard, appearing to check hall bookings, but in fact noting faces. Purbright himself strolled among the tables, as if looking for mislaid property, his expression mild and courteous. When he reached Sister Magdalene's table, he offered her a polite nod. "Your stall at the fete was much admired," he said. "Admired and blamed," she replied quietly. "The papers have been relentless." "They will tire soon," he said. "Scandals like hymns have short choruses." He turned to Frimble, who was folding a velvet cloth over the organ stool. "Mr. Frimble, do you plan repairs to the loft pedals?" "They've been tampered with," Frimble declared. "Someone's been up there without my consent." "Yet you left the spare key in the vestry," Purbright said mildly. "That's the parish's practice, not mine," Frimble retorted. "Ask Miss Etheridge." Miss Etheridge bristled. "We've kept keys there for 20 years.
No one ever complained until now. Purbright moved on without comment, letting their words settle like dust.
He paused by the refreshments table where Tudge and Blake were sampling leftover sponge cake. Both looked at him with forced geniality. "Inspector," Tudge said, "I trust you're making progress." "The public wants reassurance," Blake has smiled. "And clarity. Property values dislike uncertainty," Purbright inclined his head. "Clarity is my ambition also." He selected a cup of tea, sipped, and glanced towards Sister Magdalene, who was now helping Miss Etheridge stack hymnals. Miss Crail's absence lay over the hall like an empty seat at a family dinner. He set down his cup. "Councillor Blake," he said conversationally, "I understand you once sang in the parish choir." Blake blinked. "In my youth, yes. Why?"
I'm told you have a fine tenor voice. I wouldn't say fine. Blake laughed, a shade too loud.
"What's that to do with anything?" "Only that our midnight chorister also sang tenor last Sunday at rehearsal," Purbright said softly. "Frimble mentioned it. A warm-up echo under the loft." Blakey's laugh died. I was at Rotary." Purbright turned away as if the remark meant nothing. He picked up a hymn book from the pile and opened it to the penciled note from Miss Crail's devotional copy. "Better from loft." He traced the words with his finger, then closed it. Miss Etheridge came over with a tray of biscuits. "Inspector, will you be much longer? We need to lock up." "Of course." He took a biscuit, bit it slowly. "Tell me, Miss Etheridge, who handled bookings for the Fates choir performance?"
I did, naturally.
Miss Crail sent word from Derby with her suggestions. "Suggestions?" Purbright asked. "She arranged the programme, even named the hymns."
Efficient, really. Yes, Purbright murmured.
"Very efficient." He moved back towards Sister Magdalene, who was straightening chairs. "Sister," he said gently, "do you know Councillor Blake well?" "Only through committee meetings. He favours development." She hesitated. "Why do you ask?" Because some hymns are sung for effect, Purbright said. Not devotion. Her eyes widened, but he gave her no further clue. Instead, he crossed to the center of the hall, raised his voice just enough for everyone to hear without thinking they were being addressed. I'm curious, he said lightly. Who here knows the second verse of Salve Regina by heart? The effect was immediate and delicate. Frimble frowned. Miss Etheridge looked blank. Sister Magdalene lowered her gaze. Councillor Tudge snorted. But Councillor Blake, caught unawares, softly murmured the Latin line under his breath, then stopped, as if bitten. Purbright tilted his head.
Ah, you do, Councillor. Unusual for a car park enthusiast, Blake flushed.
Boarding school, he said quickly. Chapel every morning. You never forget. Of course, Purbright said, as though satisfied. He turned away, but Mally caught the flicker of triumph in his eyes. The test had worked. The guilty often revealed themselves not with confessions but with habits, especially musical ones. Purbright let the silence resume, then thanked everyone for their time. Sister Magdalene left first, her step lighter. Frimble followed, muttering about locks. Tudge departed with the air of a man who had witnessed nothing, but would retell it as everything. Blakey lingered to speak to Miss Etheridge, his voice low and hurried. When the hall was empty, Mally came over.
That was a neat trick, sir. Merely a question, Purbright said.
Questions are like hymns. The right one brings the congregation in on the refrain. You think it's Blake now? I think, Purbright said mildly, that a man who knows the verse, the loft, and the timetable may also know how to sing at midnight. But knowing and proving are different keys. They walked out into the evening. The sky over Flaxford glowed like old brass. In the square the last shoppers drifted home, and somewhere a single church bell tolled once, as though acknowledging a secret note. Purbright listened, then slipped his hands into his coat pockets, fingers brushing the glove and the devotional book. Next time, he said softly, we shall ask him not a question, but a favour. That always reveals the true pitch, Mally nodded, though he did not yet know what favour his inspector would request. He had learned not to press. Purbright's tests were like quiet hymns. One never heard the melody until the final chord. They crossed the square toward the police station, the evening light stretching their shadows long across the cobbles, like two notes joined on a stave. They gathered in the cool hush of the Lady Chapel. At 6. Reverend Pennington, Sister Magdalene, Mr. Frimble, Miss Etheridge, Councillors Tudge and Blake, and, a little late, Miss Crail with a music satchel and the look of someone who had rehearsed explanations on the bus. Candles were lit. The polished glass of a memorial shimmered softly, reflecting choir stalls and faces in a wavering duplicate. Inspector Purbright stood near the first step, hat in hand, as if he had come to return a borrowed hymn. "Thank you for humouring me," he began, mild as always. "This is not an inquest, merely a tidy of untidy things. We will proceed by small items."
They sing better in a group. He touched the stone step.
"First the place. Stand here and sing, and the arch folds your voice back into the nave. It blurs pitch, even gender, for any listener in the dark."
You, Mr. Frimble, once called it a choir of one. Quite right. Frimble's moustache bristled, but he nodded. Second, the hour.
Midnight at St. Jude's was not chosen for piety, but privacy. The cloister door opens to the alley.
2 rubber wedges keep it from catching, and let a singer vanish into Market Hill while the echo still hangs. Purbright produced 1 wedge in a paper bag.
From the parish hall cupboard, labelled props. Alongside habits, a brass chalice, short veils, Miss Etheridge drew herself up. "That cupboard is locked?" "Like many things in Flaxford," Purbright said pleasantly. "It is locked in theory." "Like many things in Flaxford," Purbright said pleasantly. "It is locked in theory." He held up a cotton glove, brass smudged. Third, touch. Brass polished travels, candlesticks, rails, the harmonium handle. We found one glove under the loft stairs, another in nettles by the vicarage orchard after our second incident. Harbottle sold a lady that pair, plus polish, hat pins, and wedges.
He remembers the veil, not nun length. Eyes moved almost involuntarily to Miss Crail.
She kept her gaze on the satchel. Fourth, access, Purbright went on. The loft key. There is a spare on a hook marked music in the vestry. Borrowed discreetly on Tuesday, returned discreetly on Thursday. No scandal, merely parish habit. But a new key was also cut. A tiny brass shaving travelled in the hinge of a devotional book and fell out later on my desk. He lifted the scuffed book, Miss Crail's, found near the convent gate. Inside, the hymn marked, a scrap from the Derby Flaxford timetable, and a pencil note, better from loft.
Bellows wheeze below. Practical hints, stage directions almost. Miss Crail's fingers tightened on the satchel.
Councillor Tudge sniffed, ready with outrage. Blake's polite smile had thinned. Fifth, sight, Purbright said, indicating the memorial glass. A candle-lit nave puts this plaque to work. It throws back brightness and hides small movements near the screen. The vicar saw a veiled figure and the flash of metal. Not theft, merely the brass chalice from the props box chosen to flavour the tale.
Rumour did the rest, Pennington coloured.
I suppose I helped it. We all did, Purbright said kindly. Sixth, motive.
Here. He unfolded a clipped notice from the Gazette.
Proposed sale of church land with rezoning for vehicular access. He showed the penciled arrow in the devotional book. Somebody marked the word access, not sale. To make a car park, one needs an entrance. The convent's kitchen garden is convenient. Tudge cleared his throat. Public benefit is a hymn with many verses, Purbright murmured. But the timing matters. A noisy mystery can hasten a vote, yes. A confounding one can delay it longer. Our first incident put suspicion neatly on Sister Magdalene. Our second, in the vicarage orchard while she stood in view, removed it.
Accusation, then absolution. What remains is confusion.
Committees dislike deciding in fog. He turned, at last, to Miss Crail. You arranged the fete programme from Derby named the very hymn. You returned 2 days early in the evenings and dropped your book near the convent gate. You know the loft, the costumes, the echo, the alley, and how far a town will run on a whisper. His tone did not sharpen. It settled.
You were the singing nun. A soft, collective intake of breath.
A faint creak from a pew. Sister Magdalene's lips parted, more in sorrow than surprise. Miss Crail raised her head. Inspector, I teach 12-year-olds to sing in tune. I don't conduct conspiracies. You conducted too, Purbright said gently. The first to make people look. The second to make them doubt what they had looked at. You meant no harm to Sister Magdalene, only a brief halo of scandal, quickly plucked away before the council meeting. You expected sympathy to gather like bees around the convent wall. Blake stepped forward. This is absurd. She hasn't admitted anything? No, Purbright agreed. But her book admitted company. So did Harbottle's till, the wedges, the gloves, the scratch on the orchard gate latch, and the modesty of a short veil. And there is her voice, which Mr. Frimble will confirm without malice, because the ear remembers. Frimble glanced down. She has a true top note, he muttered. Very clean, Sister Magdalene spoke at last. Why, Marianne? Miss Crail's breath left her in a tremor that might have been a laugh. Because they would take your garden, she said simply. Because Councillor Tudge calls need what is convenience, and Councillor Blake calls profit what is public benefit. Because letters and petitions are made of air.
But a song, she looked up at the arch. A song haunts, Tudge reddened.
You endangered public order. I lit candles and sang a hymn, she said. Your car park endangers our food. Blake tried a different key. You placed the convent under suspicion. I removed it the next day, she answered, too quickly, and flinched at her own words. Purbright let silence return, soft and complete. Then he said, There was one thing you did not count on, Miss Crail, the town's love of tidy villains. It insisted on Sister Magdalene first, and when that failed, it looked about for a man in a suit. I tested Councillor Blake with a question, because guilt, like pitch, can be heard. He wavered, but not on the note we needed. Your tremor was the one the room recognized. Her eyes filled. Not theatrical, merely tired.
Charge me then. Not with theft, Purbright said.
Nothing was taken. With trespass, perhaps. With disorder, if we are pedantic.
Mostly with a very Flaxford offence, manipulating decent people with their own decency. He turned to the councillors.
And you, gentlemen, might consider the indecency of forcing an entrance where none belongs. Vehicular access can seek another mouth. Pennington cleared his throat. If the council will delay the vote, he said carefully, the parish will hold a proper meeting. We might find a compromise. We usually do after the headlines fade, Tudge bristled. Blake measured optics. Miss Etheridge looked relieved at something she could minute. Sister Magdalene bowed her head in the slow, unsensational gratitude of the genuinely overworked. Miss Crail whispered, I only meant to buy time. You bought it, Purbright said. Too expensively. He closed the devotional book and set it on the Lady Chapel rail. The polished glass caught his movement and sent it back. One gesture doubled, as if the chapel itself wished to underline a point. He looked around the little gathering, polite as ever. That concludes the noise, he said. What remains is paperwork. He blew out a candle. The plaque's glare gentled to truth. Outside, a bell tolled the half-hour, unhurried, as though Flaxford could afford to arrive at its decisions when they were ready, and not before. Morning rain left the cobbles of Market Hill shining like varnished pews. The shop awnings dripped steadily, and even Mrs. Dallow's tea-shop window, usually a beacon of gossip, showed only a modest notice. Today's special, scone and lemonade, 1/6. Inside, customers spoke of the weather, the price of stamps, and the rugby score, topics that had been on holiday during the reign of the singing nun. Sister Magdalene walked through the square with a basket of vegetables from the convent garden. People greeted her with the careful warmth reserved for someone recently suspected of mischief, but now absolved. She smiled back, neither reproachful nor triumphant. Behind her, 2 children carried a box of seedlings. The kitchen plot would survive another season. Miss Crail had made her own quiet arrangements. She had resigned from the parish choir and retreated to Derby under the polite wording of family leave. The Flaxford Gazette, which had floated her as both culprit and martyr, now printed a brief correction on page 6 between the birth announcements and a notice for lost spectacles. Rumour had moved on to a spate of petty thefts from allotment sheds. Councillor Tudge returned to advocating car parks, though less thunderously. Councillor Blake continued to smile for photographers, but now spoke of balanced solutions and heritage sensitivity. The kitchen garden's lease remained on the agenda, but not at the top. Committees dislike handling hot items after they have cooled in public. At St. Jude's, Mr. Frimble restored the organ loft to its solemn order, muttering about locks and moral fibre. Miss Etheridge drafted new key procedures, though the hooks in the vestry cupboard still hung as they had for 20 years. Parish life flowed on with its accustomed leaks and draughts. The disturbances absorbed like candle smoke into stone. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, sat at his desk in the police station with a stack of reports, a fresh pencil, and the steady drip of rain against the window. The devotional book lay closed in his top drawer. No charges had been pressed. Trespass and disorder seemed poor instruments for punishing a hymn. He had written a short memo recommending a security review at St. Jude's and sent it off without ceremony. Sergeant Malley entered with 2 cups of tea and the day's post. "Peaceful again, sir," he said. "Peaceful appearance," Purbright corrected gently, as he always did. He signed a requisition for new typewriter ribbons. Malley lingered. "Funny how people forget. Last week Sister Magdalene was a menace."
"Now they buy her chutney. Flaxford has a forgiving palate," Purbright said.
"Scandal is a condiment. Tasted once, then set aside. He opened a letter from the county constabulary, routine statistics, and read without real interest.
Any word of Miss Crail?
Left Darby again, teaching at a convent school near Nottingham.
No more singing engagements. Good. He turned the page of his report.
Let us wish her silence and steady employment. Outside the window, the ducks on the river squabbled over crumbs tossed by a passer-by. Their ripples spread to the bridge where Purbright had stood days before, thinking about respectability and bargains. He watched them now with a faint smile, then bent to his paperwork. On his desk calendar, the coming week showed a jumble of minor duties: lost umbrellas, a boundary dispute between neighbours, a question about a parking permit. Ordinary work, unremarkable, polite, predictable. He found it oddly comforting. Cases like the singing nun were rare. Most of his job was listening to small complaints, letting people talk themselves out of their grievances until only the useful facts remained. Mally set down the tea. "You never told me, sir. What exactly gave her away?" Purbright wrote a date at the top of a form. "She knew the second verse," he said, "and she thought confusion would protect her. But confusion has its own echo. That was your test?"
A question, Purbright replied.
"Questions are keys. The right one opens the door quietly." Mally nodded, satisfied, and went out. The station clock ticked steadily. Purbright finished the last form, blotted his signature, and placed the papers in an in tray, already labelled "Resolved." Outside, the rain slackened. Sunlight pushed through the clouds, making the spire of St. Jude's glint like a needle again. In the Lady Chapel that morning, Sister Magdalene had replaced the candles herself, polishing the brass holders without comment. The plaque reflected her small movements truthfully, no longer hiding anything. Purbright pictured it as he closed the drawer on the devotional book. He leaned back in his chair. The case had begun with a voice in the night and ended with paperwork in daylight, as most of his cases did. No arrests, no headlines beyond a correction, only reputations slightly altered, and a garden saved from concrete. He found the result neither glorious nor disappointing, merely satisfactory, like a hymn sung without flourishes. On Market Hill, Mrs. Dallow was already telling a new story to her customers, this one about a mysterious light seen over the old railway yard. Purbright suspected he would hear about it soon enough. For now, he let the sound of the rain on the window merge with the station's quiet creaks. He picked up his pencil, sharpened it, and wrote the date neatly at the top of a blank page. Another ordinary day in Flaxford had begun.